Caroline Luce, and I am the Associate Director of the UCLA Alan D. Levy Center for Jewish Studies. I want to start by acknowledging that as a land-grant institution, UCLA occupies the ancestral and unceded territory of the Tongvar, Quiche, and Chumash peoples. We pay our respects to elders and relations, past, present, and emerging, and recognize that the dispossession of Indigenous peoples is ongoing, and that land acknowledgements have, as Ananya Roy put it, frequently become gestures of liberal inclusion, propping up regimes of exploitation and exclusion. The Tongva people are still here, as is the movement for Indigenous sovereignty. And I'm going to include some links in the chat about the ways that UCLA folks can learn about the work being done on campus now and support it. So here's those links. This event is part of a series at the Levy Center this year, exploring race and anti-racism in the field of Jewish studies. And I'm honored to have two outstanding and innovative scholars with me today to examine these themes through a regional prism. I want to give a quick shout out to Maxwell Greenberg, who helped conceive of this event, and to the incredible Levy Center staff who are providing technical support. I will note that this event is being recorded and will be available for screening on the Levy Center webpage. Please do allow for a week for the video to upload. We are also streaming live on the Levy Center Facebook page. We're going to talk for about an hour and a half and then allow for a little bit more time of unstructured time. The chat has been disabled, but the Q&A is open. So if you have questions, please put them there and someone will answer them as soon as we can. Now, to our guests. Sarah Imhoff is an associate professor in the Department of Religious Studies and the Bourne's Jewish Studies program at Indiana University, the author of Masculinity and the Making of American Judaism, and the co-editor and co-founder of the journal American Religion. Sarah has another book on the way called The Lies of Jesse Stampter, Queer Disabled Zionist, that will be published later this year, so keep an eye out for that. David Kaufman is the Richard Schiff Chair for the Study of Canadian Jewry and an associate professor in the Department of History at York University in Toronto, the Associate Director of the Israel and Golda Koshitsky Center for Jewish Studies, and the Editor-in-Chief of Canadian Jewish Studies. He is the author of The Jews Indian, Colonialism, Pluralism, and Belonging in America, and his second book, titled No Better Home, Jews, Canada, and the Sense of Belonging, was just released by University of Toronto Press. So a hearty congratulations there. We've dropped links to both their work in the chat, so please do check that out and buy books. Show your support by buying their books. But instead of offering summaries of their work on my own, what I'm going to do is let these amazing scholars introduce themselves in a way that will be more generative and engaging for all of us. What we've decided to do is start by sharing short fragments of archival materials that we've used in our work and read them together so that you can get a feel for our frames and approaches. I've given Sarah and David a preliminary prompt, and I'll let each of them respond using their source material of choice, and then we'll respond to one another. So the questions on the table relate to the much romanticized figure of the Jewish frontiersman. Where and when did this figure come from? And how has this figure been put to work to advance ideologies of belonging, both in the US and around the world? And I'll let Sarah go first here.
Thank you so much. So I'm coming to you today from Indiana University, which is also a land-grant university built on the ancestral homelands and resources of the Miami, Potawatomi, and Shawnee people. And today I'll be talking to you a little bit about some stuff that's from my book and some stuff that's not from my book. So I'll begin by giving you a neat little glimpse into the archives. And I think this is a neat glimpse into the archives. What we'll see here is one acculturated Jew imagining the West, the frontier, through the lens, a historical lens, of another Jewish person who fought on the frontier. Now I'm having trouble. Oh well. Are you seeing? You're seeing the not.
I see your whole
Why is this not working? It doesn't want to, sorry about this.
To be
There we
expected.
go. How about that?
Yeah.
Are we,
better.
okay. Thank you. Sorry about that little technical difficulty. Okay, so this image is an image of some of the earliest immigrants to the US through a program called the Jewish Immigrants Information Bureau. The person who is two from the left in this photograph is Rabbi Henry Cohen, and he was the rabbi in Galveston, and he was one of the major figures in this movement. So the idea behind this movement was, in the early 20th century, to have Eastern European immigrants come to the US, but go directly to points Midwest and West, rather than settling in the overcrowded cities like New York and Boston. And acculturated Jewish Americans imagined that these immigrants, by going to points West, would become American. They would become American by helping to settle the West, and they would also become American by becoming manly in American ways. And you'll notice that I talked about immigrants and then manly, and it's true that when acculturated Jewish Americans were imagining this, they were really doing a lot of imagining of what male immigrants would do and how male immigrants would become American, and not a lot of imagining about Jewish women. So Henry Cohen is someone who thinks a lot about the West, but he's not someone who spends a lot of time on the frontier. Nevertheless, he is also kind of an amateur historian, and he publishes, slightly before the JIIB, he publishes a piece called The Brave Frontiersman. And he does the research for it and publishes it in the American Jewish Historical Society's regular journal. So his audience here is other Jews in the US who are reading English, especially educated Jews. And you'll see in this, he's going to tell the story that's a historical story, but a much mythologized one, of a Jewish man who fights on the frontier. This is part of the article. The chief spoke at some length and to the point. Who is he talking about here? He's talking about an indigenous leader. And here he's going to recognize that these wars and violence that were happening on the frontier are not just because indigenous people are uncivilized, but actually they have some real gripes with the way the white Americans have operated here, and the fact that white colonists are planning to continue colonizing. So the chief spoke at some length and to the point. It was the old story of honest, oppressed Indians and treacherous, tyrannical white men. Much truth was told with native eloquence, and the Great Father was asked to stop the building of the Iron Road, which would soon drive away the buffalo and leave his children without food. So this is in Henry Cohen's voice, and he's doing some of the same mythologizing about noble savages, indigenous people as talking in these ways like the Great Iron Road. Of course, they called it a railroad too. They knew about the Transcontinental Railroad. But here there's an acknowledgement that the conflict is over something. It's over land and resources that did belong to these indigenous people. Nevertheless, Cohen goes on to celebrate a white soldier he's a Jewish soldier, in a way that's relatively uncritical. Our war in the interior had now ended. So this is in the late 1860s, and he's talking about the Civil War. And our troops were quite ready to turn their attention to the frontier. So here there's a sense, right, that we had a war, and the natural next place to take that war is to the frontier, right? And who will be the people we are fighting against? Indigenous people. So accordingly, Major General Hancock moved out in March 1867 with a force consisting of some 1,500 men composed of infantry, cavalry, and artillery. And here's the message he's supposed to send. To make among the Cheyennes, Arapahoes, Kiowas, and Comanches a display of force. To notify them that if they wished for war, they could have it. and to explain to them that fully that hereafter they must keep off the route of travel, railroads and other roads, that all depredations and molestations of travelers must cease forthwith, and that all threatening of our military posts by them, verbally or by message or otherwise, must cease at once or war would ensue. Right? This is a message of war. You must stay off railroads and roads that we've put through your territory. You can't send any threatening messages verbally to military posts, which are also taking their resources, occupying their lands. Unsurprisingly, this leads to violence. But here we get the beginning of the celebration of Jewish participation. Thus far, you can't quite tell why this would be in a publication about American Jews and about American Jewish history. This is the offer for the military leader to pursue a campaign in this area with a small group of men. The offer was promptly accepted, and the men were soon found in the immediate vicinity of Fort Hays. Several of them were ex-soldiers who, having served out their enlistment long before, had adopted the life of the frontiersman, thus making the best possible material for the purpose in hand. And then he says, there's this one exceptional guy. He's this strong, strapping white guy, and everyone expected him to be the hero of the day. There's also another exceptional one. The other seemed to be inferior and in all respects unfit for service, a Jew, small, with narrow shoulders, sunken chest, quiet manner, and piping voice, but little knowledge of firearms or horsemanship. He was indeed unpromising as a son of Mars. And after 49, that's the 49 other men in this contingent, had been obtained, was accepted only in order that he might be counted on rolls to make up the 50 and thus enable the expedition to start. The rest of this goes pretty quickly, but we learn that this, The Little Jew, which is, I kid you not, a poem that gets circulated quite widely about this serviceman, celebrates his participation in this violent encounter. Again, we see almost no acknowledgement that there might be something morally ambiguous about the violent encounter. The sense is simply that Jews are part of the American project of expansion, and that is something to be celebrated. And we also see here the ways that a certain kind of masculinity, violent masculinity, is the one typically associated with subduing or civilizing on the frontier. And so stereotypes about Jewish men might not fit those. And yet there's a celebration that Jews participate in that very kind of violence and subduing that we see across the parts of the frontier in this time. So I will leave this little bit be and pass it on to.
Yeah, David, did you want to respond directly, or maybe to go ahead with your?
I did only. I mean, I'm going to do my little bit because I prepared, a text as well. But I just wanted to share with you, Sarah. I didn't know what you'd bring. I have this poem as well in my book. This is about Sigmund Schlesinger, right? It's the Battle of Future Island. And I can read a stanza or two from the poem as well. Incidentally, if you guys can see this, kids, heroes of history, highlights of history, the Frontier Scout, a comic book that was made for a mass-produced American pedagogical materials to teach American kids about, heroic American history, and he features in there as well. So it says, when the foe charged the beast works and the madness of despair, the bravest of souls were tested, and the little Jew was there. When the weary dozed on duty or the wounded needed care, then another shot was called for, the little Jew was there. Okay, it goes on, but I like that you picked that source.
Yes, that it really made the rounds. Like, it shows up in a whole bunch of places, attributed and unattributed. I knew you had also written about it, so I thought it would be fun.
Thanks. So just to briefly introduce myself and say that I'm zooming in from Toronto, which is on land that's been taken care of by the Anishinaabe Nation and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Huron-Wendat, and now, of course, remains still home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities, including the current treaty holders, who are the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. It's territory that's all around the Great Lakes, that's subject to what's called the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which is an agreement to peaceably share and care for the lands of the around the Great Lakes. Okay, I'm going to share my screen as well. You guys see this? All right. Okay. Oops. Okay, so maybe we'll first have a read of a portion of an autobiography written by a man named Sam Aaron. So he writes as and what's in square brackets here is my writing. So as an 11-year-old in the summer of 1877, en route a 6-horse stage from Cheyenne, Wyoming to Butte, Montana, Sam Aaron says, I absolutely knew no fear. Nothing was too hard or too dangerous to undertake. I'd go into the wilds and ride for days without seeing a human being. The Apaches were on the warpath, killing and stealing. In those days, all reservations were controlled by the Indian agencies in Washington, D.C. Those agencies had caught the restlessness of the Indians. Instead of giving them the allotment, they would hold back some of it, and the Indian was always in need and therefore committed crimes. He felt he was being cheated of what was due to him. So let me just pause here, as we've got kind of one theme in the opening, which is about this very, sort of self-aggrandizing prepubescent boy who, wants to show himself intrepid and a, brawny frontiersman, both in touch with the nature of the West and clearly unafraid by the potential violence awaiting him. And in the second, chunk of the quote, he's sort of sympathetic to the conditions that produce violent engagements, violent exchanges between Native Americans, particularly the Apache, where of course there was much warfare between the Apaches and settlers. But then he kind of shifts gears shortly later on, and a couple of paragraphs later in his autobiography, remembering one occasion years later, after 5 workmen had been killed in a charcoal camp near Fort Huachuca, Arizona. Aaron described how 2 white camp workers killed one of the Redskins, cut his head off, and brought it to Charleston, Arizona. I took the Indian skull, burned off the flesh and hair, sandpapered it, and made it a beautiful skull. I said, Jim, I have something I want you to do. Climb up the pole and put the Indian skull on it instead. So the third part of the source here, it takes a pretty dramatic turn, of course, and we have sort of in his describing how he beautifies this murdered man's skull and suggested that it replace the American flag on top of a pole. I mean, I couldn't think of a more dramatic example that I found from the archives when I was researching this book about symbolically marking the frontier West as land won by the grit and sort of independence of stateless men who were becoming state. Incidentally, Aaron later becomes a mainstream clothing merchant, and he writes this reminiscence about his life in Arizona and in Utah, Wyoming, and California, and kind of builds a life story of himself as a life that's a person who's transformed, a life that's preoccupied with shootouts and outlaws and drinking and wild Indians and gambling, sort of the general mystique of the Wild West, but he also becomes this upstanding citizen businessman at the center of a town, and is quite explicit in his memoirs that the point of writing these stories for his audience is, and this is also a quote, to keep alive the memories of the early history of the frontier, which he fretted might be lost. And so putting together adventure and mobility and opportunity, and of course this violence, is part of the creation of this frontier myth that immigrants, new immigrant, Jewish immigrants also wanted to participate in, that would sort of follow the arc of the mythic West itself. One other thing to point out is that he doesn't tell the story of his life as one in which immigrant outsiders are trying to become a part of the social fabric of new settlements, or anything, of course, about the lands that America's imperial expansion captured. In fact, he almost never mentions that he's an immigrant at all. It's like not an immigrant narrative story, but a Western, a Western pioneer story. And in this source, I see many others that I could have brought that do similar kinds of work. I just want to share the screen and share the screen here and show you a couple of additional images of other Jews who make it out west. This is Carl Herberg, and he's posed in front of what's a kind of Adobe general merchandising store with the Jacarilla Apache employees of his. And so, there are lots of images that Jews take of themselves. You see in his posture, he's kind of looking off. They're all looking off from the distance, but he's at the center of it, and he's got his legs spread, and he's, sort of firm and protected, no less, by potential, potential marauders, by the Jicarilla who he's clearly hired to support him. And then just a couple other images that kind of speak to some of this imagery of the Jewish frontiersman, but from a kind of Eastern perspective that pokes fun at this myth of the brawny American frontiersman. And it has within it the claim that Jews can't fit there. So just like the source that Sarah brought, there's some apology, some insistence that no, Jews can be there, and they have to push against this myth of a emasculated man. There's lots of Jews who sort of reproduce this as well. So this was a pop song, Yankel the Jewish Cowboy, a kind of novelty song that that did well. And you can see from the images that the Jews in the images are unfit for this world of the frontier. So this was an actual man like Herberg, really was insisting that he was, and putting it into play and talking about it, and like Sam Aaron remembering it, this kind of idea of Jews' unfitness for this place really circulated quite widely. And here's a set of sort of homemade photographs that were made kind of in response to this, is like early, multimedia response to the pop song, by and you can see in one image Yankel Finkelstein, a self-portrait, goes out to these woods as a peddler, as an itinerant peddler. He's got a stack of hats in his hand, but he's also interested in going just to shoot wild Indians in the second panel. And in the third, he becomes Yankel the Jewish cowboy, and you can't see it very clearly, but he's standing on one or two figures, it's hard to tell, of shot native people. So it's comic, and it's actually violent, and quite disturbing. And I'm not going to share this one because that's enough. Although I did want to make just one more quick comment, that there are many other images of the frontier Jew, not just the pacifier of Indians, but there's the counterpoint, which is the image that Jews create for themselves of being the Indian initiate, of having the respect of of Indians, of becoming an honorary Indian, of getting an Indian name, of becoming captive. And this is another similar kind of, it's the flip side of the same coin image, because I think in these images, the Jew must know something of, or even embody or internalize something of the Indian in order to be a true frontiersman. And I think that both the pacifier, the kind of violent perpetrator of violence, and the knowledgeable or sympathetic or honorary or truly respected kind of gone native Jew are really flip sides of the same thing, because they have to digest the digest Native Americans in order to have their seat at the table, right? It's kind of this I could just eat you thing. So you see this kind of imaging in memoirs and local news and obituaries and all sorts of primary sources.
And the Frisco Kid, right? Dancing the hora. When
Yeah.
he teaches the tribe his dance. Yeah, totally. I love
And
that.
in that one, it's interesting. In the Frisco Kid, the Indians are Yiddish speakers.
Mm-hmm.
So they are both Judaized Indians and, well, Indianized Jews and Judaized Indians. And it's actually part of a long comic tradition of Jews who, did stage bits and comic novels and all kinds of things of Indians speaking Yiddish, which is just a kind of fascinating kind of trope that appears in the kind of cultural bookshelf, which I see as very different from the kind of archival and local historical bookshelf of the West itself.
Yeah, very interesting. So we're going to dig in here a little bit more. And I do want to say that I see your questions in the chat. These are a lot of interesting things. We're definitely going to get to them as we get through here. I just really quickly wanted to offer a sort of example from a different side of the Jewish community, a different type of source, and that's the radical Yiddish speaking community. We often don't think, other than perhaps Rachel Rubenstein's wonderful book on the subject, about the ways that these narratives echoed through the Yiddish-speaking milieu, and certainly not the radical milieu. And so I just wanted to offer an example here. I'm going to paste the poem into the chat. This is part of a digital anthology of locally published Yiddish literature we created a couple years ago for Mapping Jewish LA. And then I'm going to bring it up on the screen so that it's nice and visible for everyone. Okay. So what we have here is a poem called Zum Wilden West sing ich, I Sing to the Wild West. And I featured it in an article which I explored how left-leaning Yiddish writers used history to reimagine their racial designations, crafting what I called a Jewish fantasy past that moved Eastern European Jews from the margins to the center of the mythic saga of the Western frontier. This poem was written by Chaim Rosenblatt, who was born in what is now southern Ukraine and raised mostly in Brooklyn, where he studied to be a teacher and became active in Die Junge, which is a group of literary Yiddish writers trying to forge a sort of uniquely American style that would move Yiddish culture forward. He then moved to Detroit to serve as an editor of a Yiddish newspaper there, and then to LA after he visited on his honeymoon and kind of fell in love with the place. And he really became the leader of a kind of fledgling group of Yiddish writers in LA that were really attempting to craft a kind of Western style of Yiddish culture that would reflect their particular experiences on the Pacific Coast. So this poem was the page one of the first forum that they published for this effort, a journal called Mairev, which is West, and it was published in 1925. And shout out to my friend Herschel Hartman, who helped me translate this. So the poem really offers a kind of epic ode that traces the history of Western colonization and settlement. And speaking of the points that Sarah and David have raised, you can see that from the beginning, he's really trying to separate Jews and Jewish history from this saga that he's laying out. You can see he's directly referencing settler violence, and explicitly excluding Jews from it. That's why I highlighted this line here, right? How can the hands that held the wandering rod for generations and generations on all the condemned roads of exile combat your copper arms and steel fists and scalping knives? So much like Sarah was saying, you could sort of imagine in his mind's eye seeing the little Jew who can't do this, who's incapable, he can't fit here, he can't do this. And this continues through the next stanzas where he describes Jews sort of waiting and waiting, their heads bent in prayer, not overloaded rifles, to really underscore this separation from the West during its transition from its, quote, wild past to its modern present. And as Sarah and David have just both pointed out, this is part of the fantasy past, right? Just that Jews weren't even part of this. They weren't there. We were waiting over here praying. As I argue in the article, Rosenblatt's poem was directly inspired by the work of one of his literary idols, Walt Whitman, whose 1865 poem Pioneers, O Pioneers used a kind of similar form to describe on heroic terms the Western youths you can see here who are felling trees, stemming rivers, piercing mountains for mines, and upheaving virgin soil to create what he calls at the end a newer, mightier world in the West. Poems like this, of course, are foundational to the kind of mythic image of the frontier that you both have been describing. Rosenblatt's piece departs from Whitman's in important ways that I want to underscore. For one, while Whitman inserts himself periodically into the poem using the first person I, Rosenblatt exclusively exploits the plural we, writing his poem in the collective voice of the Jewish people and drawing repeated contrasts between Jewish peoplehood, which he's sort of saying is grounded in a collective history in exile, and Western peoplehood, which he's saying is grounded in their relationship to the land. And we're, of course, going to talk about that a little later in our conversation. And also, while Whitman's poem is entirely triumphalist, like the pieces that Sarah and David's shared, there's an acknowledgement here of the violence and displacement of colonization. I'd say this is even stronger in Rosenblatt's piece, where he's describing just rampant violence against humans and against the natural world. So bringing to the fore the negative consequences of colonization, in this case, to further separate Jews from that process, right? To draw that contrast. It wasn't us. It wasn't us. Now, this is not to say his depiction of indigenous folks is entirely positive. He invokes a bunch of tropes, calling them red-skinned hias. There are scalping knives. There are tomahawks. I think we see a flattening of indigenous identity that some of you have identified in the Q&A, where sort of all Indians are one Indian in his mind's eye. But he does show sympathy towards the displaced and highlights these negative consequences in ways that challenge Whitman's triumphalist notion of conquest in his piece. And yet, what I find so interesting is that in the final stanza, after all this, Rosenblatt switches to the future tense to claim the West as a site of Jewish renewal, just as it had been for the pioneers. So, but a generation of ours will arise still over the ashes of your long extinguished generation, as a phoenix arises from its own destruction and fire with colorful widespread wings, young, nimble, and new. So here he's both locating Jewish peoplehood within this multicolored swirl of peoples. So we are others among racial others, probably a nod to the diversity of Boyle Heights, which is the neighborhood he settled, a residential neighborhood east of the LA River. But he also seems to be aware that Jews had advantages that would enable their mobility, their acceptance, and their success. So he's simultaneously asserting Yiddish-speaking Jews' status as others and their ability to transgress that status, to rise from the ashes like a phoenix, indicating to me that he understood that Jews had access to racial privileges that other immigrant and minority populations in Boyle Heights did not. So as I describe in the piece, Rosenblatt really renders a sort of version of history here in the poem that opens up a space between otherness and whiteness for Jews in the racial landscape of the West, where they could be as American as pioneers, but as Jewish as their forefathers in exile. He hails the West's promise of redemption, advancing a kind of Jewish manifest destiny in which Jews move from the condemned roads of exile to assume the mantle of the pioneers. But rather than present that promise as one of racial privilege or entitlement, he naturalizes it as a byproduct of the exceptional whirlpool environment of the West. This is sort of a trope in the historiography as well, right? Attributing Jewish inclusion to this, quote, fluid racial landscape of the West. But to me, this poem really gets at a tension that I explore in my research, which is that on the one hand, Jewish radicals like Rosenblatt, who was later labeled a communist. I mean, he was speaking at communist rallies and was very involved in the sort of left milieu. he did forcefully challenge the colonial order in Southern California. In their organizing and their writing, they illuminated the connections between American imperialism, racism, capitalism, and empire in the West as forcefully as one can imagine in times where they were sort of not allowed to do that. But they also benefited from colonial systems of dispossession and dominance. And as Rosenblatt's poem reveals, absorbed the ideological and racial logics of those systems. So they conceived of a West as a site of Jewish belonging and claimed access to the good life promised in the promotion of Southern California, but cast that access not as a form of racial privilege, but as a universal opportunity afforded to all Westerners willing to work as hard as the pioneers, right? So kind of that ingestion, that transformation that you're talking about, David. And in this sense, their Jewish fantasy past functions in constituting and maintaining a Jewish racial designation based on whiteness. Now, not white supremacy, I will say, or white racial grievance, but rather a whiteness of expectations, right? Of acceptance, of access, of mobility, expectations that they could claim the benefit of inclusion as settlers without surrendering their otherness or becoming racialized subjects. This sort of delicate line that I see them drawing in the left that maybe is a little bit different from the kind of binaries of, you know, I must ingest or I must kill. They're sort of saying, well, we can separate ourselves from all of that and yet still claim the mantle of the pioneers and sort of get all the benefits of that kind of transformation. So I just wanted to share that because I do think it's important. Sometimes we differentiate between generations of Jewish immigrants or the regions that they came from, but here we see themes that are kind of cutting across. And I'm going to stop talking and let you two respond. I have another prompt, but I figure I'll let you respond first.
Go for it, Sarah.
This is all really wonderful. I'll be brief about it. I think that the relationship to whiteness is really important, as you're noting, Caroline, in part because there's a temptation to imagine that it's unidirectional or teleological, like Jews didn't used to be white, and then there's a process of whitening. But in fact, there is a legal assumption from the beginning that you cannot enslave Ashkenazi Jews. And that is because they are assumed to be white. So Jews are partaking in whiteness very early. This is not to say that there's no exclusion or prejudice. There's certainly religiously based exclusion and prejudice, and then there are other kinds of communally based exclusion and prejudice. But I tend to think it's usually a mistake to imagine that anti-Semitism or Jewish exclusion in, say, the 19th century is primarily racial, in part because it's not. Most of the time that we see that, like I said, very real, but it's possible to experience certain kinds of exclusion and have them not primarily be about race. So this, I think, helps us understand how Jews can be at once part and parcel of a white settler colonial project and simultaneously not be imagined to be at the center of that polity.
Mm-hmm. Totally. Yeah. And I think Rachel Rubenstein, who I hope is joining us, maybe she's out there in the Zoom, has really pointed to the idea that actually looking at these engagements with tribalism sort of reveal an interesting layer of estrangement from the liberal individual project entirely, right? That this is not, they're reaching for the language of tribe because it's a fascinating challenge to a sort of liberal individuated version of citizenship that Jews are ambivalent about. And she does a really good job of tracing that. So I definitely, Rachel would have been a good one to include. We've had conversations about this before.
Yeah, I'm not so sure.
Or you want another prompt?
I just want to quickly say that I think both of your points are really right on the mark, and that the research that I put into producing this book really concurs with both of your insights. Sarah, yours about about the kind of constitutional basis of Jews' whiteness. And though there certainly is something of anti-Semitism that's experienced with a distinctly Western flavor when it's there, the racial conundrum is much bigger and clearly assumes in all legal ways and in ways that the state supports its Jewish settlers and enables the process of bringing them to the West in the first place is clearly on side. And Caroline, your point about Jews sort of needing to I mean, I think I like to think of it as I'm not sure that that there that the communalist kind of response um, is explicit, like is trying to push against individualism and liberalism and these kinds of core ideas. I think there's just more than one project that Jews are aiming to accomplish out in the West in the first two generations, say, of being in specific communities. One is a communal project of maintaining a sense of Jewishness, and the other is of producing a sense of belonging in the great epic process of forging a new nation. And so to the extent that those two don't where those overlap, there needs to be a slight different articulation from it, but they clearly borrow from the available kind of drawer of ideas for how to be a good Westerner.
Yeah, I appreciate that caveat, because I do want to say, Rosenblatt is a socialist. He was flirted with the Bund as a teenager and sort of got involved in socialist politics. So that communalism was not necessarily, inherent in Jewish settlers by any means. This was sort of a particular byproduct I see of his kind of ideological vision of the Jewish future, which was one grounded in socialist politics and collective forms of resistance. So that's actually an important little.
Yeah, and I just add that even the conservative, like Jews who are conservative at the turn of the century, conservative Jews who also have the project of of producing stable, continuous Jewish communities, have a communalist project, which may be somewhat at odds with some of the myths of the West, but there are also religious communities of all sorts that are doing similar kinds of communitarian projects and establishing churches and synagogues and all sorts of other community projects as well in the West. So these things aren't, I think it really is part of part of the Jewish ambition from various points in the ideological spectrum.
Yeah, amen. I kind of want to drill in there just because we've got a couple questions about this in the chat, and maybe what I'll do is sort of flip our questions out of order and go to this question of the land, because I'd love to pick up some of those projects that you just mentioned, David, and the projects that you referred to, Sarah, right? The Galveston project is not the only resettlement project that is being sort of conceived of at this moment of mass migration. And I wondered if maybe the two of you could sort of drill in on these questions. I mean, on the one hand, we have a wonderful question in the chat from Maxwell Greenberg about the sort of self-awareness about Jewish participation in settling the West, and whether that was viewed explicitly as part of a nationalist American project or a Jewish nationalist project. And then, of course, we have, just the question of territoriality generally, right? Because scholars of settler colonialism, including Patrick Wolf, have really pointed out the fact that native elimination is sort of a means to an end, right? That what distinguishes settler colonialism from a project of genocide is that the end goal is territoriality. As he puts it, territoriality is settler colonialism's specific, irreducible element, right? So it is about that access to the land and acquiring that land. And so I wanted to give you both a chance to talk about kind of territoriality, these nation building projects, these community building projects, and how Jews' relationship to the land kind of comes in there. So I have a couple prompts, but that probably gives you enough to work with, and I'll put the prompts in the chat. Sarah got to start last time. David, did you want to go ahead?
Sure. So I have one chapter in this book that I've recently written about land, but it's also a chapter about violence. It's about violence and land. They to me are conjoined. And there's, I think, two sort of dimensions to how I think about it anyway. Obviously, in one most basic sense, it's physical, and this is important, not to be overlooked, but it's also metaphysical. There's a kind of metaphysics of land insofar as Jews may relate to the land differently from their other settler communities, and even more importantly, from the indigenous people that they encounter in the West. So they see land as partly as a vehicle for social belonging and for economic advancement, but also as a potential cure for the predicament of the landlessness of the Jewish people, to relate to it, to have it, to know it, is something sort of important. So let me just back up for a second. I think maybe a good example, a practical example of violence and land acquisition is in the Jewish role of the Suttler. And the Suttler, if you don't know this word, is basically an itinerant merchandiser, not necessarily a peddler, but someone who procures and sells dry goods and foodstuffs to the military. So they're a merchandiser that moves around with military attachments, and it's therefore not formally institutionally connected to the military, but services military men, and obviously makes actual profit from it. Jews also, of course, move around the West, following gold seekers and engaging in economic activity that's meant to procure, again, dry goods and foodstuffs to these towns. But they play an actual facilitative role. So they're both in this, as Suttlers, they're both part of the military machine and slightly apart from it. So I'd say where Jews, Jews have a different conception of land from other settlers on account of this legacy of the Luftmensch that they carry around with them, of being an air people, a landless people, and they wanted to prove that they were also of the land. But I think they ultimately also had a certain kind of detachment from it, and saw it as a resource primarily, as a fungible asset, like it's capital, it's worth something. So Jews they speculate land, but they don't speak of their ties to it in these ways that certainly clearly Native Americans would speak to their relationship with their own land. It's an asset. There's other interesting stuff about it, like Jews have an ability to spin great fantasies about what large tracts of lands could do to resolve the Jewish question, of the European Jewish question. So we see these starting back as early as the early 18th century. I found like a case from the 1730s of actually a non-Jewish, a Scottish baron, but who nonetheless fantasized in print about putting 30,000 Jews on Cherokee land as a way of explicitly sort of solving the Jewish, European problem. And this kind of thing gets echoed throughout, the Jewish contribution to this sort of study as well. So the famous Gratz family, acquired like 300,000 acres of the Ohio Valley and had some not actionable plans, but sort of thoughts about, installing a Jewish kind of homeland there. Or a famous Philadelphia businessman named Julius Stern, who wrote up a plan to buy and settle Jews on Indian land in Nebraska. He wrote about this in the very first issue of the important American newspaper, The Occident. And of course, one more, maybe the most famous one, Mordechai Emanuel Noah's plan to found Ararat, which is like to found a colony of all the ingathered exiled Jews on Grand Island, New York, in the 1830s and 40s. And this was actually an interesting fantasy because he thought that Native Americans were descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. So on this island, a pretty small island, as it turns out, he imagined both Jews and American Indians gathering and producing a kind of semi-sovereign homeland. This is like 30 years before Zionism. And then one last point that I just want to make on this count, that Jews take they try to take credit and responsibility for Americanizing large tracts of land in the Jewish press. So you see lots of stories in lots of places, Oklahoma and California, Arizona, of kind of pioneer Jews who acquire very significant tracts of land and then sort of bequeath them to the community and cheer themselves and are later cheered on for sort of deserving credit for Americanizing the land. Maybe the best example of this is the case of Jack Goldstone, who was, given credit. It's not, whether it's deserved or not is not really the point, but the press kind of praises him for convincing America, the United States, to purchase Alaska. He's a trader with the Russian Alaska Trading Company, which becomes the Alaska Trading Company, I believe it's called. And he has close connections with the Schloss family in California, who speaks with California's Senator Cole, who then convinces the Secretary of State to to make the Alaska purchase. So these kinds of fantasies of deserving credit for huge swaths of land are not so much what the land itself will do, how Jews will be in it, but of what it will do for their process of sort of feeling more American, or the more practical sense of the profit that's to be gained from controlling its trade routes or its areas for trade. So as a property or commodity of sorts.
Wow. So Sarah, I know you've written about some of the projects that David just mentioned. Please go ahead.
Yeah, so I mentioned the Galveston Project. There's another organization that's like maybe the most unfortunately titled organization ever, the Industrial Removal Office. That wants to take Jews who are already living in cities and move them out west.
2,100 settled in LA through that program.
Yes, yeah, I don't know who was in charge of coming up with the name, but they clearly didn't have a marketing degree. So there's a strong sense, I would say, among many acculturated Jews that back to the land movements are a great way to demonstrate Americanness. The, maybe we can call it irony of this, is almost none of them do it. Almost all of them think this is a great thing for immigrants to do. This is a great thing for Jews who aren't us to do. So the vast majority of American Jews don't go out west, don't buy farmland, don't go to agricultural schools. There are a few Jewish agricultural schools with this same back to the land kind of ideology. And that back to the land ideology is, I think, drawing on two sources. One of those sources is a larger US-based nostalgia for the land and farming and a simpler life, right? You can still hear that kind of thing, but it very much comes up in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The idea that somehow there was something really truly American and really simple about a nuclear family living on a farm, or maybe even an extended family. It's really truly a fantasy for almost all of these Americans here, not just Jews, lots of people. Then there's also a similar back to the land ideology coming out of Zionism. So the idea there is sometimes critical of Jews and Jewish bodies that are maybe weak or alienated from the land, and that going back to the land is one of the things that will regenerate Jews, make Jews more manly and stronger. And so even for US Jews who aren't Zionists, some of these back to the land conversations from Zionism are informing how they imagine Jews can and should be. So I do think that, I mean, in part that answers some of Maxwell's question here, is that even at times that there's not an explicit Zionist connection, most of the Jews who are involved in the philanthropic end and even the leadership end are non-Zionists, although a few of them are Zionists. Even when it's not an explicit tie to Zionist thought, there is some of that set of assumptions and some of that literature that's informing how they imagine Jews should relate to the land. So that's both from a Jewish nationalist project and from a US nationalist project, right? Here, Jews can also relate to the land by reclaiming or claiming for the first time for civilization these Western lands from indigenous people. Even when it's not, even when indigenous people are left out of that sentence, which you'll often see in Jewish materials, like it's taming the land, period.
Yeah, I want to dive a little bit deeper on this bodies idea, because you're writing on bodies and how we can use the sphere of the body to think through things like gender and belonging. I think is magical and wonderful, and I want to highlight that for a second, because one of the things that happened with the Industrial Removal Office vis-a-vis LA is I think they had this impression, oh, they'll be returned to the land. But LA, of course, they weren't given those jobs. And so there are these really funny letters back and forth where they're like, you're sending us too many tailors. Like, we don't need any more tailors. We need farmers, and you're not sending us farmers. And they literally buy them train tickets and send them back to New York in some cases because, for Jewish elites on the receiving end in LA who run the Hebrew Benevolent Society and are supposed to do job placement and assist in these adjustments, they have the same concerns about the reputation of the Jewish community and sort of unemployed indigent Jews floating around in the city. So that fitness of Eastern bodies and Western bodies and how they fit together is really interesting to me. I, of course, study some folks who were part of utopian colonies, which was another version of this back to the land phenomenon. And I remember there's a sort of allegorical fable about this guy Baruch, who was part of a colony in an unnamed place. And it's a bunch of Jewish intellectuals from New York, and none of them know how to farm, and only Baruch can do the farming. And it's this saga of Baruch goes off to the mountains one day to cut timber and never comes back, and the colony fails, and he comes west. And I thought this was an entirely fictive story that was doing some of the work of Jewish bodies being out of place in the wild. And then I spoke with a now graduate student at University of Wisconsin, Aaron Fagan, who was like, no, there was a real colony. It was the Clarion colony in Utah. And here's all this information about it. So I wondered, can you tell us a little bit about that sort of, Jewish bodies in the West doing work and how that differed from or challenged or sated the appetite of these sort of, sponsors who are in New York? I mean, were they pleased with what they'd created? Were they concerned about its failures? I don't know, maybe you could drill down there a little bit.
Yeah, I think they're both pleased at what they see as successes and concerned about what they see as failures, which they often chalk up to the people themselves. There's often this romantic idea that farming is kind of like something from the past, and so therefore it's unskilled labor. So basically we just send people to do farming because people always did farming, so you could just do farming. And it starts to sink in for some people that no, actually you can't just send some people to the land and hope they figure out how to grow enough food to feed themselves. Like, that's not actually a plan that will work. And that's when you get some of the start of the agricultural schools where they think, well, we'll have scientific farming. I think that this part of this story is good to think about women, because when you get these colonies, unlike the Galveston movement, which basically just wants to send men places, that in fact initially they complain that they've sent the wrong number of immigrants, and that like a third of them are women. But these communities, and there are a few of them, do include women, and you can see them in the photographs. And so then there's this question about what is appropriate, because the land is supposed to transform your body into a strong manly body. But what do you do if you're a woman? What tasks are appropriate to you, and what jobs are just required of all of us if we're going to live here in this community together, right? So there are lots of ideas about what is and isn't appropriate for women to do. Here are dairy, so cows. Chickens are appropriate for women. Canning and jarring, these things are appropriate for women. But then when you look at the photographs, what are the women doing? Pretty much everything the men are doing. So there's the ideology about how the land should transform these maybe puny men into real men, and the ladies should be doing the more domestic or delicate things. But like in reality, that's not what's happening.
Yeah, very, very interesting. David, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I have 2 points. So one, there's a kind of correlate, and it'd be interesting to think about if there are differences more carefully or similarities of where the obvious are of Jewish colonization projects that happen in the Canadian West and the prairies. There's something like 40 agricultural colonies that are established between the 1890s, and they all fizzle after they're pretty much, I think, all done by the 1920s or 30s. But these are colonization plans by a similarly unfortunately named organization, the Jewish Colonization Association, which is like, it makes the obviousness of settling the Canadian prairies part of the colonial project, which is exactly what it was. They were cleared of native title with a set of both violent and legal tools, including epidemiological ones, diseases, epidemiological battle, and a famous book called Clearing the Plains, if you want to be more about this, to make way for agricultural settlements. But these were organized by community, like like heritage communities. So the project was to send groups of Jewish farmers and groups of Latvian farmers and groups of Norwegian farmers as bundles of family to farm contiguous lands and make a colony made up of families that are specifically crafted as a family thing and not just individual. So it was a family project as well. Yeah, so that would be interesting to do some comparisons here. I mean, one thing that I can say is that the project, was strange from the federal government's perspective when they, observed and compared how the Jews did this colonization farming project compared with other national communities. They did it very differently. They were partly blamed for their lack of productivity and the lack of success in it because they spent too much time getting together in evenings for literary salons and for insisting that their kids travel to great distances from one household through farmland to the next to like take piano lessons and this kind of thing. So they were kind of partly besmirched by the politicians who were trying to create a farmable West for them. Only one other point that I wanted to make on this thread about the muscle Jews, about muscular Judaism that you referred to, Sarah, beginning of the comment about the sort of parallels between Zionism and this American project. Yes, I mean, so what they share is this kind of muscular Jewish sort of strategy about correcting bodies, and you also said that they share a kind of allegiance to nationalism, although of course in the Zionist case it's to Jewish nationalism, and in the American case it's to American nationalism. So yeah, this is one way of saying it, and I think it's perfectly legitimate. Another way of saying it, though, is in just more strictly Jewish terms, is that the muscular Jewish project for Zionists is nationalistic, and the American muscular project is assimilationist. Yes, there is some kind of attempt, obviously, for these Jews to remain Jewish, as all assimilationists certainly want. I mean, those who wanted to completely disappear and have absolutely no traces of their Jewishness left on their bodies or names or families did so. We don't call those people the assimilationists. The assimilationists are the people that we study in the past who really wanted to be thought of as indistinguishable from their American counterparts. So here's a muscular Judaism that's both it's very flexible in that it can serve very different kinds of Jewish visions for a good Jewish future.
Yeah, and just one thing. Very few American Zionists moved to Palestine before the state of Israel. Very few American Jews, percentage-wise, moved to the state of Israel. So even the American Jews who are Zionists generally are not themselves going to go settle the land. So it's almost the similar approach to lots of people think it's a great idea for Jews to go settle the land, by which I mean other people, not really me, right? And so I think that you're absolutely right to point out that there are tensions, but that American Jews can latch on to this healthy bodies, muscular Judaism, because it gets them both things. It can be part of a Jewish nationalist project and part of an American assimilationist nationalist project.
Yeah, and I'll just add the caveat, because a few folks have asked about this in the chat, that Sherry Rabin has really done an excellent job. I recommend her book, Jews on the Frontier, in terms of thinking about how religion and Jewish practice manifested in these environments. But one of the things I will say is, in that assimilationist vein, is that some of the Jewish elites in the West are very proud of both their integration and their commitment to community. So there are papers generated just to essentially brag about the fact that, hey, we have a minyan that meets every week. We have a synagogue, even though there's only 20 families here. We are, in the process of building a burial society. They're sort of boasting about the vestiges of Jewish community life that they are holding up. Even as Sherry documents very well in the book, they're experimenting and violating all sorts of strictures and stuff like that and assimilating in other ways. But, part of what I include in the article is this fact that the Jewish elites in LA, mostly from Posen and Bavaria and Bohemia, so German and French, are in a lot of ways very proud of the fact that they've developed this model that is both assimilationist and Jewish, right? That Jews in the West, that is what the Western exceptionalism narrative is born of, is that it's not mutually exclusive. You can both uphold these standards of community and replicate the forms of community life that were so valuable elsewhere, and you can, be super American and super engaged in building up of civil society. LA had a Jewish mayor in the 1860s. It had a Jewish sheriff. So you can play all these Wild West roles and also be a Jew is part of the argument they're making to promote the region to their co-religionists and attract them here. So the IRO folks are believing very much that you can have it both ways in that sense.
I think this is probably well reflected in the street too, and not just among elites. A kind of balance, and perhaps there are some subtle differences between, who tips to one scale or the other. But on the one hand, between like the dialectic of rough and respectable, and different modes of masculinity that get cheered on, either frowned upon as Jewish or not Jewish, not Jewish enough, but seen in all kinds of other sites, like in sport clubs, and the prevalence of boxing and cockfighting, and then only later baseball and other forms of group teamwork, sports where sportsmanship kind of reflects true manhood, but also in other sort of sites of roughness of in hotels and gambling and billiard halls, or in brothels, and in fraternal orders and fraternity lodges, which of course are exclusively male spaces, where the promotion of fraternity and courage and character and industry and these kinds of are middle class, respectable, but also kind of some rough edge. Maybe they're more on the respectable side, or in bands or militias, things that Jews are also involved in that are not really, they're involved with as members and not organizing themselves, as elite representatives of the people.
Mm-hmm, totally. So we did have one interesting question in the chat that I think actually builds on this kind of bodies conversation. So I kind of want to inject it. My next question was going to be about violence and how you're both sort of thinking about violence in terms of these questions of sort of morality and manhood and civilization and savagery. But we did have a really interesting question in the chat about more intimate encounters and indigenous Jewish marriages, which is something I believe you touched on in your book, David, if I'm remembering correctly, these sort of cases of, I think one of them is Bibbo, of course, who becomes the tribal leader. And then we have more examples of, Jewish merchants who married indigenous wives and sort of maybe vice versa. I don't know if there's vice versa, but I thought maybe I'd fold those questions together. I know that's kind of an awkward fit, but sort of intimacy and violence, because violence, of course, is intimate as well. Particularly the story you told about the skull. My goodness, if that's not an intimate handling of bodies, that certainly kind of connects these things. So maybe it's awkward, but I want to throw that one to both of you.
Sure. Well, I'll say that that first, that for the most part, so there is a kind of sexualization and gendered intimacy dimension to this. I would say that for the most part, the stories that Jews told about their own kind of frontier experience and the kind of early grounding of the pioneer days is one that tends to shy away from stories of sexualization of Native American women, and it's certainly gendered. It only goes in that one direction and not the other. And this is, clearly from a communal and, community perspective that, that values endogamy, and is markedly different from some of the other language that other white settlers use that is often hypersexual about sexualizing Native American women and being invited,
Right?
into their bodies to sow the seed into their body. It's a real, claim on the land through the woman's body. And you don't see this, or at least I didn't see this in the, in the kinds of local histories and texts and stuff that I was reading that where Jews describe their experiences of the West. That's not to say that sex didn't happen. There was sex. In fact, they have quite an interesting, small body of work that doesn't focus, doesn't give us much detailed evidence to work with, but certainly lots of claims and lots of evidence of itinerant traders, who are having sex, sometimes, kind of partnering up and even marrying Native American women, and oftentimes leaving kids with them. So this sort of sexualization does happen, but I see it as a kind of important difference between Jewish encounters with indigenous people and other white settlers. They go with two other important differences that I saw. One is the lack of missionizing impulse. So I know I'm moving away from sex and violence here, but Jews they don't missionize. That's not part of the Jewish project, insofar as there is a Jewish project. It's not what Jews do when they encounter Native Americans, unlike other white Christians. They're really not thinking about that at all. And I suppose, as we talked about earlier, their relationship with land, I think, is a little bit different. So maybe I'll stop there on the sex part, but come back to the violent stuff after Sarah's got a chance to comment.
Yeah, so intimacy and violence are interestingly connected in the way that I think US Jews want to see themselves, say, late 19th century up to the 1950s, and you can certainly still see echoes of this. And that is to say, American Jews are willing to own violence when it's what they imagine to be legitimate violence. So there's a celebration of, these Jews serve in the US military. They're part of our empire building. They're the little Jew who is going and subduing the frontier. However, Jewish men are not violent in intimate ways. So the idea, this is in some ways a stereotype, and I don't mean that as a fact. I mean, this is a presentation of what it means to be Jewish or what it means to be a Jewish man. The claims are things like Jewish men are not alcoholic. They're not drunks who get in fights. They don't fight, they're not street fighters. When they commit crimes, they're what we might today call white collar crimes or like theft, but they're not violent crimes. Jewish dads are not violent in family contexts. Again, these are ways that the Jewish community describes itself to itself rather than an accurate depiction. There is, of course, Jewish intimate partner violence, but that will become a challenge to talk about because so many Jews have ingested and reproduced this rhetoric about Jewish men not being violent. And that we see very much in these early years. And that Jewish men aren't violent, again, is about what is seen as unacceptable kinds of violence, which we might also note are the more intimate or person-to-person kinds of violence, rather than the violence that can be abstracted as serving your country or helping spread the civilizing mission. And here I'm going to pick up on what David talked about as far as civilizing goes, especially when the US is doing its civilizing talk with respect to indigenous people. Civilization and Christianization go hand in hand. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, its closest ties are to both Protestant groups and Catholic groups. And part of what it does when it's negotiating is decide who should get to run this reservation, more or less, the Catholic group or the Protestant group. And this is not a way that Jews participate in the rhetoric of civilization. They absolutely do participate in the rhetoric of civilization. many American Jews love to talk about the Jewish contributions to civilization. We see that a lot, late 19th, early 20th century. But their idea about civilization, they would describe as a Western civilization, what might later get problematically described as Judeo-Christian civilization. But they don't see the civilizing effort as a Christianizing effort, which is a dominant, and I want to emphasize, US government way of imagining it. So I think that's another interesting difference here.
Yeah, let me just add that. So the Bureau of Indian Affairs was part of the War Department for most of the 19th century, and then it was moved in the middle of the century in 49, I think, where Congress moves it to the newly established Department of the Interior, and it gives six Christian denominations, one Catholic, and then five different Protestant groups, autonomy to run agencies. And there is a brief discussion about whether Jews should be permitted in this sphere, and the decision is against it in Congress. So there's a kind of moment where Jews might become officially, as a religious body, part of an instrument of the state to manage Indian affairs, and that doesn't happen. But I also just wanted to echo your point about the sort of a kind of missionizing, the civilization mission. I call it in my book missionizing for capitalism, about the specific role, not just of bringing civilization to these places that were uncivil because they were indigenous lands, but specifically in the actual encounter with indigenous people, where Jews cheer themselves on and write about what they do in having kind of pretty ordinary commercial exchanges, or not ordinary, but sort of petty level, really low level commercial exchanges. They write about what they're doing as commercializing Indians. They're training Indians into being better commercial agents, and they speak of it as kind of economic missionizing, and they praise, they earn praise much the ways that Christian missionizers, for on religious terms, articulate their project as well.
Yeah, that's fascinating, David. There's an example here in Los Angeles of Caspar Cohen, who's doing that missionizing of capitalism, but with Basque sheep herders, and his willingness to hold their money while they go herd their sheep helps him to grow the Bank of the West, which is one of the banks that still exists, comes from that same kind of impulse that you're talking about. I'll just add here that some of this language of bodies and sort of ogling at Jewish bodies does actually become a part of state violence that's inflicted against Jews. My work really looks at the ways that not only Jews benefited from colonial systems of dispossession and dominance, but also the way they became subject to the same. And I specifically mean that in regards to the communists, right, who are challenging this capitalist mission. So to me, the willingness to become evangelizers for capitalism, to become missionaries of capitalism, as you described, David, is actually the kind of contingency upon which Jewish inclusion is based. And those who forcefully challenge that capitalist system and involve themselves in organizing among the workers whose bodies are making the transformation of the West happen becomes super duper dangerous. And so there's this citrus strike in 1919 is one example that's on the top of my mind. And the reporters who are following it, this is 35 IWW activists who are described as explicitly as Jewesses and who are ogled at for their Jewish bodies, their particular hairdos, the fact that they're wearing pants, the kinkily curly hair is a line they repeat several times. So they're coded even when they're not being explicitly referred to as Jews. And, the press coverage is really giving credence to the idea that their very physical presence in the landscape of this citrus belt, which it basically runs east from LA to San Bernardino, is suspect, right? And that those Jewish bodies have no place in this landscape. So I don't want to do a sort of hashtag not all Jews here, but there is a degree to which this same sort of carceral and cultural practices that, as Kelly Lyle Hernandez has written, are vestiges of Indian removal and really sort of inform mass incarceration, become the foundation of a mass incarceration apparatus in LA. Those same practices are wielded against Jews in certain cases, and giving credence to a particular kind of anti-Semitism that is directed explicitly at Jews who challenge that kind of evangelizing capitalist role. that the West has given them or opened to them. So I just wanted to throw that in there. We are getting close to time here. And I'm so sorry, there are just so many lovely comments and questions in the Q&A that I'm afraid we won't be able to get to all of them. We'll all try to take a look and maybe offer some specific answers as we go. But just as kind of a final round, I wanted to both give you guys some space to potentially make some connections to the present, if that's what you're interested in doing. We've just had 12 months of incredible reckoning in America, maybe not in Canada quite so much, but the issues that the pandemic has brought to the fore. We did have a question in here about the kind of, is there any relevance for the frontier? And so maybe we'll kind of end with those questions about the frontier, because Sarah, I noticed you use that language several times. David, you use that language. I've been sort of striking that from my own verbiage because I'm trying to avoid that trope. But I wondered if, Jeremy Edelman and Steve Aaron, the first year I was in graduate school, wrote this wonderful piece kind of differentiating borderlands from frontiers in an effort to rescue the frontier as a particular zone of colonial settlement. I wondered if you guys see any relevance there, or is the frontier and this imagined frontier and the way these myths continue to color the historiography part of what Lila Cornwin Berman has identified as American Jewish history's exceptionalism problem? Because I certainly see an argument there. So last question, we'll go around. Thank you to all the guests who are here. We're going to stop recording at the end of this round of questions, but maybe stay on the Zoom for a little bit longer to address some of the issues that are coming up in the chat if there's things you wanted to pick up there. So a final round, and then we'll close it out here. So, Sarah, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, I can say something about the frontier as an academic category. And that is to say that I think one of the helpful things about it is that it's not a neutral term. And by that, I mean, it within it suggests that there are power relationships that are not equal, that it's not, there's a way that borderlands can suggest like, oh, here's just where my people interact with your people. Whereas frontier is quite explicitly from the perspective of someone. Indigenous people weren't like, hey, here we are on the frontier, right? This is a white perspective about expansion, about colonization, about taming the land. And that's more or less something that is central to telling this history. So I think one of the things that's helpful about frontier is it acknowledges that the power dynamic is very much in favor of white settlers. And that's what's coloring much of how we are still able to read these past events. So that's why I wouldn't describe the West as a borderlands, because I worry that that does too much flattening of what in this particular instance is a really profound dynamic in favor of one perspective and one set of people, from resources, from violence, from many other aspects of that interaction. And so I understand why some people would say this isn't a useful term, or it's a romantic term, or it's a term we should get rid of because it has baggage. It can be a romantic term, and it definitely has baggage. So I do understand why one might say, that's not a word I want to use, but I would say it's a word I'm perfectly comfortable using because it allows us not to lose sight of the power dynamics of colonization.
Absolutely, absolutely. David, do you want to tackle that
one?
Yeah,
it's a good answer, Sarah. So I too am not particularly hung up on the words. I mean, I do think that borderlands is a good word in general, because it assumes that there's two directions to a story and not a single path of discovery. And there's a long, trades in a long and pretty pernicious idea going back to the doctrine of discovery, and the papal bulls that are signed by signed in Rome, like immediately after 1492, that see this as a one directional thing. But I don't really see any real issue or kind of problem in reducing any complex, you shouldn't reduce any of these complex studies to any keyword, borderland or frontier or conquest, as Patricia Limerick does, as she prefers, which is also, there's debate about process and place and this kind of thing. I think that, it's been a while, truthfully told, since I read the Aaron and Edelman piece, but there were a set of responses to it that it engendered in the American Historical Review, if I remember right. And I think the really good point that their critics made was that, well, 2 points. One was that, the historiography really has to do a better job of talking about Indian agency, about, in a full, robust, from, you said it's a one-way thing, yes, so there has to be a full dialogical counterpart. And I think since that piece came out, that was probably 12 years ago or something, it was a while ago, there's been a lot more, that have really done a really deep justice to, to describing the process about this exchange with terms that are deeply respectful to Indian agency. The other point that I seem to remember, which I thought was pretty good, was that us English language scholars are generally fail to think about scholarship from non-American sources. And maybe this comes to your point, Caroline, about about Lila Berman's sort of American provincialism or exceptionalism criticism, is that if we did a better job of consulting with the Spanish language scholarship, or even doing even more comparative work, say of Caribbean or South American or Canadian, and maybe even South African or Australian, and sort of think about colonial indigenous encounters with a wider comparative lens and not just those of the British Empire, then we might get we might get a richer result. I mean, I think though that debate was about a larger process from a wider angle than what we've been dealing with today. And indeed, the question of where to locate Jews in this process specifically, I don't think that even if we do a really great job and speak to Jewish studies and Jewish history audiences, I'm not sure that if we sort of track Jews' presence in a really precise and insightful way, I'm not sure if it will make a meaningful, like a difference that's meaningfully large enough to change those great debates in American Western history. I mean, it's important for us to do this work, but again, I don't know that it changes the big one so much.
Yeah, I certainly tend to agree with you there, David. And I think that Indigenous scholars, and for my work at least, Chicano studies scholars are having much more interesting conversations about these issues than perhaps American Jewish historians ever could. I do wonder, though, I mean, to me, I think one of the things running through today is the power of the imagination, right? And that's really something I'm trying to figure out in my work, is that, perhaps they weren't entering into a mythic frontier in the way they thought, right? And they weren't really doing the kind of manifest destiny work that they might have thought, but, it has this powerful impact in terms of the way they experiment and innovate, and this kind of, this is a sort of negative word, but like this reckless abandon that they bring to the project of coming to LA and to building the Yiddish life they want to see in LA. I mean, I end the piece on Rosenblatt with this idea that like they believed in the transformative power of the West, and it transformed them, right? It for some reason released them of some of the confines that partisanship and party platform on XYZ held in New York. That power was kind of removed. And these guys felt that they were in this wild environment where they could do and experiment and all these kinds of things. And so I'm sort of working through in my own work how to get at that idea of the frontier as a subjectivity, whether or not it was a real sort of, in the military parlance, as you described, Sarah, that sort of zone of violence and interaction and collision at the time that they arrive. They embrace it, and it becomes kind of a defining feature of Western communities. So what I'm going to say now is I'm going to have the crowd and everyone give a final round of applause to David and Sarah. We're going to thank them so much for their wonderful, wonderful, wonderful contributions to this conversation. And thank you everyone for being here.